The 19th century also saw the development of photography. Now, the word photography was derived from the Greek phos, meaning light, and graphe, meaning drawing or writing. So the word photography literally means drawing or writing with light. Now, the ideas that led to this innovation were not necessarily new. I think I previously mentioned how artists and others had been using the camera obscura since at least the early Renaissance, if not since antiquity, which consisted of a dark room or box with a hole called an aperture through which light passed and sort of projected an upside-down image of the exterior scene onto the opposite interior wall, which the artist could then trace to kind of capture the precise details of the scene. By the mid-16th century, they had reduced this tool to a small, portable camera obscura, and they added a lens to help focus the image and a mirror to help invert it. Or sometimes artists would also use the even lighter camera lucidia, which projects the image of the subject being viewed onto the surface that the artist draws upon so that they see and trace the scene at the same time. But these projections were not permanent. They still had to be traced or drawn by hand. And so true photography could not exist until images could be fixed or made permanent through a chemical process. And so photochemistry was a chief focus of research in the 19th century, with various inventors trying to formulate light-sensitive chemical compounds that could be applied to a surface in order to record the patterns of light and shadow. By about 1830, several had figured out how to record their image, but stopping or fixing the image so that further exposure to light would not further darken it was more challenging. One of the first to achieve a fixed image was the French inventor and chemist Joseph Nicephore Niépce in about 1826 or 7. He placed a camera obscura loaded with a polished, light-sensitive, bitumen-coated pewter plate and aimed it toward the view outside a second-story window of his country house in Le Gras, France. He then uncovered the lens for anywhere from 8 hours to several days, and the result is the earliest surviving camera-made photograph, or heliograph, as Niépce called it, which he took from the Greek words for sun and writing. Now, despite the presence of recognizable objects such as buildings and rooftops, the image is very grainy and it lacks precise details. Nevertheless, this milestone really sort of offered, in Nietzsche's words, quote, the first uncertain step in a completely new direction, end quote. Before his death in 1833, Niépce briefly worked with another Frenchman, Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre. Daguerre was an accomplished painter and stage designer, and he was very experienced with the camera obscura. In 1829, he traveled to Le Gras to learn Niépce's heliographic process. Later, Daguerre discovered certain light-sensitive compounds that, when exposed to light for 20 to 30 minutes, would record a latent image on the coated plate, meaning an image that was invisible until it was later exposed to mercury vapors. By 1837, he had developed a method of fixing his image by bathing the plate in a solution of salt, and then the chemist John Frederick Herschel suggested he use the chemical hyposulfate, which greatly improved the process. In 1839, Daguerre announced his new photographic technology to the world, the daguerreotype, which was a highly detailed, luminous image fixed to a copper plate coated with silver and polished to a mirror finish, treated with iodine to make it light sensitive. Daguerre's technique reduced exposure times to about 10 to 15 minutes and created a lasting image that would not dim with further exposure to light. However, it only produced a single image at a time, and that could not be easily duplicated. That image was also very fragile because it was printed directly on the plate, and so it had to be protected inside a velvet-lined glass case. This still life scene, which is a sort of collection of objects in Daguerre's studio, shows the precise details that this technique could capture. You can really see the crisp lines and kind of the high contrast of light and shadow. But because the long exposure time, the daguerreotype was really best for recording stationary objects like this. For example, this 1838 image captures a view of the Boulevard du Temple, a broad boulevard in Paris that was designed by Haussmann just a few years earlier. The view is taken from a high window, maybe in one of the new apartment buildings or a sort of hotel. Again, notice the crisp details here and the sort of high level of contrast. But what would have been a very busy street, bustling with pedestrians and horse-drawn carriages, instead appears to be deserted. This is because, to capture the image, Daguerre had to allow light into his camera for about 8 to 10 minutes in the bright daylight, and so any people or things in motion did not register during that long exposure time. If you notice, the sky also looks blank, which is pretty common in early outdoor photos, because the light changed too quickly for the chemical mixture to capture details like clouds. This is, however, the first known photograph to record human figures, because we have a man sort of standing still in the lower left-hand corner having his shoes shined, but this was very likely staged by the artist. So the daguerreotype, again, is a highly detailed, luminous image fixed to a copper plate coated with silver and polished to a mirror finish and then treated with iodine to make it light sensitive. The image develops directly on the plate with an exposure time of about 10 to 20 minutes, but it's very fragile and it must be protected in a velvet-lined case with a glass front. The process only makes a single image, and the surface of the plate is highly reflective, so it can be somewhat tricky to look at. But these were highly innovative, very important to the development of photography sort of processes, and they were also, again, very highly detailed and sort of pretty as objects themselves. Now, right around the time that Daguerre announced his innovation, an American artist and inventor named Samuel Finley Breese Morse traveled to Paris to exchange information with him. Morse would share information on his own invention, the telegraph, in exchange for information about Daguerre's photography. Morse introduced this daguerreotype to America immediately, and just a short while later, by about 1841, he had figured out how to reduce exposure times enough to reasonably take portrait photographs, and so the daguerreotype became even more popular. Around the same time, Englishman Henry Fox Talbot was experimenting with his own techniques, which he patented in 1841. Talbot made negative photo drawings by placing plants and other objects on light-sensitive paper and exposing them to light. He then figured out by repeating that process with a negative image and another sheet of light-sensitive paper, he could create a positive image. He called his process the calotype process. And so this was really the first negative to positive process, and it became the basis of photographic printing. Talbot's negatives could be used multiple times, so he could produce many positive images quite cheaply. However, the positive calotypes were softer and more fuzzy than the daguerreotype. Talbot knew the imprecision of his calotypes couldn't compete with the highly detailed daguerreotype for commercial and documentary purposes, so instead he chose to explore photography's visual, aesthetic, and artistic qualities. This image, titled The Open Door from 1843, it really emphasizes these shadows that create a pattern of diagonal lines, which is echoed by the placement of the broom here in the foreground. And this sort of contrasts with the very rectilinear architecture of the scene. The soft lines and the slight haze contribute to the sense of nostalgia that's being expressed for the quiet, sort of rural way of living that was quickly being replaced by industry, commercialism, and urbanization in England. In about 1850 or 51, the British sculptor and photographer Frederick Scott Archer sought to combine the high level of detail of the daguerreotype with the reproducibility of the calotype negative. He discovered a collodion silver nitrate mixture on glass could be exposed for only a few seconds to create a glass negative that could then produce countless positive images on paper with crisp details and a wide tonal variation. The biggest disadvantage of the collodion process was that it needed to be exposed and developed while the chemical coating was still wet, meaning photographers had to carry portable darkrooms and liquid chemicals to develop their images immediately after exposure. Despite this drawback, the wet collodion process was sort of unparalleled in quality, and the cheap cost made it an instant success. It was really a major step in the development of early photography. And so further advances in technology kind of continued to make photography a less labor-intensive process. By about 1867, a dry glass plate was invented, and that really reduced the inconvenience of the wet collodion method. Prepared glass plates could be purchased, and that eliminated the need to kind of fool with all the wet chemicals. Now, once the negative to positive process had been figured out, photographers began experimenting with various chemical compounds to increase the quality of the paper print produced with the negative glass image. Various print types were used in the second half of the 19th century, but the albumin print, which was invented in 1850, was the most common type for about the next 40 years. It produced a clearer image than its predecessor, the salted paper print. The albumin print is a type of print that's made from paper that's coated with albumin or egg white, and that makes the paper's surface very glossy and smooth. It's then coated with a solution of silver nitrate. The albumin and the silver nitrate form light-sensitive silver salts on the paper, and when the glass negative is placed directly on the paper and exposed to light, it forms the image on the paper. And so the albumin print really became popular because it produced such a rich, sharp image. Photographers in the 19th century were pioneers in a new artistic endeavor, blurring the lines between art and technology. They frequently used traditional methods of composition and sort of married these innovative techniques, and they were able to create sort of new visions of the material world. Photography right away became popular for portraiture because photographs were much more accessible and affordable and less time-consuming for both the artists and the patrons. So traditional portrait painters really saw a rapid market decline in this period of time. The prominent French artist, writer, and inventor known as Nadar opened his first photography studio in about 1854, and although he only practiced for about 6 years, he was one of the most sort of influential photographers in Paris at the time. He's really known for his collodion negative albumin print portraits of well-known artists, writers, and politicians, especially because he focused on the psychological elements of photography and really aimed to reveal the personalities of his sitters rather than simply making attractive portraits. Bust or half-length poses, solid backdrops, dramatic lighting, fine sculpturing, and concentration on the face were trademarks of his studio. His use of 8 by 10 inch glass plate negatives, which were significantly larger than the popular sizes of daguerreotypes, accentuated those effects. This 1864 and 1865 set of portraits from the actress Sarah Bernhardt are a great example of Nadar's work. Bernhardt was just about 20 at this time, and she had really just begun what would be a very long and extremely successful acting career, and Nadar's portraits helped to increase her celebrity. Nadar very consciously chose to pose the actress without the normal collection of elaborate props, and instead he placed her sort of in the foreground, really emphasizing her delicate facial features and slender neck, surrounded only by this very lush fabric, kind of leaning on this rather plain column. And so photographs at this time were still very highly posed because even though the collodion process used much shorter exposure times than the daguerreotype, they could still be up to a minute, and so the sitter needed to be very still. But Nadar, again, has really sort of captured a sense of elegance and kind of the introspective aspects of Bernhardt's personality, not just her physical likeness. Sort of interestingly, Nadar was also very well known, famous in fact, because he was the first person to capture aerial photographs, and he did this from the basket of his hot air balloon flying over the city of Paris. British photographer Julia Margaret Cameron was a highly creative individual and another great portraitist who received her first camera at the age of 49 as a gift from her daughters. Cameron became well known for her portraits of celebrities, especially of well-known British historians, scientists, artists, and writers, many of whom had long been family friends. Cameron, however, took a more radical, sort of unconventional approach in her portraits, and that can be seen in these two portraits here. The one on the left from 1867 is a portrait of Thomas Carlyle, the British historian. And you can really see how Cameron has kind of pioneered the use of close-up perspectives and sort of highly controlled lighting to enhance the images of her subjects. But even more radically, she has intentionally rejected the sharp focus of commercial portrait photography, which she felt accentuated the physical attributes of the sitter, but really neglected the inner character of the subject. And so Cameron argued that photography could and even should not only record what was visible, but also the allegorical, poetic, and sort of intuitive aspects of life that we may not readily see from day to day. And so she used special lenses and long exposure times to blur the details and create this sort of characteristic soft focus that kind of emphasized that careful lighting and the thoughtful expressions of her subjects. Cameron often strove to express biblical and literary ideals of innocence, wisdom, piety, or passion, and she saw these things embodied in her family and friends. And so she sought to express them rather than aiming for the precise likeness as most professional portrait photographers would have. The Metropolitan Museum of Art website explains about the image here on the right, Zoe, Maid of Athens. The website says that here Cameron photographed May Prinsep, her sister's adopted daughter, and by allowing Prinsep's slight movement and kind of using that intentional soft focus, Cameron has instilled a sense of breath and soul into this living apparition. For the true subject of her photograph was a poetic evocation of love and longing written by Lord Byron as he had departed from Greece in about 1810. So the poem that she was trying to, that she was inspired by and that she's trying to sort of express here, it says, "Maid of Athens, ere we part, give, oh give me back my heart. By those tresses unconfined, wooed by each Aegean wind, by those lids whose jetty fringe, kiss thy soft cheeks' blooming tinge, by those wild eyes like thee row, my life, I love you." Many of Cameron's images feature women in idealized scenes of motherhood, as in this image on the left, Madonna with children. Here she evokes the Virgin Mary with this tender vision of a mother and her two children surrounded by what appears to be this sort of large white halo. She often draped her subjects in dark cloaks and set them against plain backgrounds, which lends this sort of timeless quality to her images. And so by adjusting the focus of her lens to create a soft, slightly blurred effect, she's referencing the qualities of painting as well. And so Cameron and her sort of pictorialist contemporaries would really pursue more painterly compositions, subjects, and qualities, hoping to elevate photography to the level of fine art. The Metropolitan Museum of Art website also explains that Mary Hillier, who was a very beautiful young house servant in Cameron's home, was often sort of pressed into photographic service for Cameron, frequently in the role of the Virgin Mary, which she is playing in the left here, but she's also shown in the image on the right depicting Sappho. And so on the right here, Cameron has kind of shown us this profile portrait that's perhaps inspired by reproductions of Italian paintings, although it's quite unclear what it really has to do with the Greek poet of Lesbos, Sappho. And so the Metropolitan Museum points out that although Cameron often set out to portray these certain ideals, she also would often title pictures after the fact because the image seemed to embody the character of a certain literary or biblical figure, or maybe even just because there was more of a market for images of the Virgin, Sappho, or other famous kind of literary and mythological figures than there would have been for portraits of her own niece or one of her own sort of servants. From its inception, photography has also served a documentary function by recording and preserving important people, places, events, etc. However, as technology developed amidst the political and social turmoil of the 19th century, photographers really began using the new medium to bring public attention to current events and the suffering caused by war, hunger, poverty, and other things, all with these very sort of artfully composed images. And so photography proved to be this new tool that could make visual statements in a much more believable way than any other medium could. However, 19th century viewers also clearly understood that photography could not record the visual world without any bias. Now, one of the most important 19th century photographers was Englishman Roger Fenton, and he had this profound influence on the medium despite the fact that his career really only lasted for about 10 years. After abandoning his studies as a lawyer, Fenton became a painter in about 1839 before picking up photography in 1851. Under the direct patronage of Queen Victoria, Fenton traveled in 1853 to the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea, where England, France, and Turkey were fighting a war, the Crimean War, against Russia. Fenton spent March through June of 1855 with the troops, producing 360 wet plate glass negatives in his horse-drawn darkroom. To avoid offending Victorian sensibilities, he refrained from photographing the dead and the wounded, but his more than 300 images of encampments, battle sites, and portraits of all military ranks became the first extensive photo documentation of any war. And while the laborious process and lengthy exposure times denied photographs of battle, Fenton successfully captured the sort of psychological intensity of war instead. And so when these photos were exhibited in England, his reputation as sort of an early photojournalist was kind of established. And so his most famous photograph from this series, and also one of the most well-known images of war, is this, which is titled The Valley of the Shadow of Death. And so the Getty Museum explains, across a desolate and featureless landscape, not a single figure can be found. The landscape is inhabited only by cannonballs, so plentiful that they first appear to be rocks that stand in for the human casualties on the battlefield. The sense of emptiness and unease is heightened by the visual uncertainty created by the changing scale of the road and the sloping sides of the ravine. Borrowing from the 23rd Psalm of the Christian Bible, the Valley of Death was named by British soldiers who came under constant shelling here. Fenton traveled to the dangerous ravine twice, and on his second visit he made 2 exposures. He wrote, "In coming to a ravine called the Valley of Death, the sight passed all imagination. Round shot and shell lay like a stream at the bottom of the hollow all the way down. You could not walk without treading upon them." He also wrote that he had intended to move closer to the site, but danger forced him to retreat back up the road, which is where he captured this image. American photographers also used the newly developed technology of photography to document the historic events of the American Civil War in 1861 to 65. Timothy O'Sullivan and Alexander Gardner both began their photography careers as apprentices in the daguerreotype studio owned by Matthew Brady in New York City, before later setting out to capture their own images of battle that would give citizens sort of a greater access to the death and carnage of war that they'd really never had before. The bulky equipment and wet plate technology that required a dark room and liquid chemicals made their work difficult, but that didn't stop them. O'Sullivan allegedly attempted to photograph during battles on multiple occasions, and at least twice he claimed to have been struck with shrapnel, but the long exposure times didn't capture action or motion, and so most of these early war photos won't show combat, but instead they will be taken in encampments or maybe in the aftermath of the battle, kind of out on the battlefield. Yet both O'Sullivan and Gardner really wanted to move beyond traditional images of war that simply showed armies at rest, and instead they really wanted to capture the grim and sort of gruesome realities of warfare. In 1866, Gardner published his photographic sketchbook of the war, the nation's first anthology of photographs, which included 10 photographic plates of Gettysburg, 8 of which were by Timothy O'Sullivan, who often served as a field operator for Gardner, and then 2 of them were by Alexander Gardner himself. This image was by Timothy O'Sullivan, and it was featured in this sketchbook of the war. It's titled A Harvest of Death, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And so here we see the bloated corpses of the Confederate dead awaiting burial after the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, this battle caused the most casualties of the entire conflict, and if you notice, O'Sullivan has sort of raised the horizon line, maybe by squatting down with his camera, to sort of extend the battlefield into the hazy distance and kind of imply that the violence and the carnage of the war may never end. The image also captures, sort of in crisp clarity, the details of the face of the soldier in the foreground who lies with his arms flung out to the sides. And so this kind of emphasizes the individual human aspect of these events. In the book, the extended poetic caption that originally accompanied this photograph was written by Alexander Gardner, and it read, "It was indeed a harvest of death. Such a picture conveys useful morale. It shows the blank horror and reality of war in opposition to its pageantry. Here are the dreadful details. Let them aid in preventing such another calamity falling upon our nation." Here's another example from Gardner's book, this time by Gardner himself. This image is titled Home of the Rebel Sharpshooter Battle at Gettysburg, and it seems to capture the tragic death of a sharpshooter or sniper killed in his lookout spot. However, this rock formation was quite short, and it was in the middle of this battlefield, and so it would not have been a good spot at all for a sniper to kind of set up shop. Instead, Gardner and his assistants have staged this photo to sort of intensify the emotional effect. So they drug the dead body to this site and posed it so that the head faced the camera. And then Gardner placed his own rifle next to the body to sort of emphasize the soldier's horizontality and the cause of his death. And so this really raises questions about visual fact and fiction, although again, 19th century viewers really understood quite well that photographs were not without bias, and this practice was not at all uncommon in the time. However, it also brings up sort of ethical and moral questions, and so this image has, for a long time, been sort of the subject of controversy. In 1878, new advances decreased the exposure time of photographs to 1/25th of a second, allowing moving objects to be photographed and lessening the need for a tripod. This new development is celebrated in English photographer Edward Muybridge's sequence of photographs called Galloping Horse or Horse in Motion from about 1878. Designed to settle the question of whether or not a horse ever takes all 4 legs completely off the ground during a gallop, Muybridge's experiment lined up 12 cameras to capture a sequence of 12 photos of a horse running down a racetrack. The cameras were connected to cables that stretched across the track and were tripped as the horse ran by. This series of photographs proved that yes, a galloping horse indeed has all 4 legs off the ground at once, but it also really demonstrated the new photographic methods that were capable of nearly instantaneous exposure. Finally, in 1888, George Eastman developed the dry gelatin roll film, making it easier for film to be carried. Eastman also produced the first small, inexpensive cameras, allowing more people access to the technology. As processes and products became more simplified and accessible, photography quickly became a hobby for millions of people, not just academically trained artists. Whereas earlier photographers sought to imitate the styles and genres of traditional visual arts, amateurs and hobbyists they took quicker, sort of less staged pictures of casual subjects in everyday life. As more people began to own and operate cameras, fewer and fewer of them had any training in art at all, and so we start to see unplanned elements appearing in the backgrounds of pictures, pictures taken from sort of odd angles and vantage points, and figures and forms will appear at the edges of the frame and be sort of cropped off. And so this all sort of resulted in the totally new aesthetic of candid or snapshot photography. So for example, in the late 19th century, Paul Martin, he photographed people in the streets of London, concealing his camera so that he could capture candid shots of chance events. In this image titled Cab Accident, High Holborn, London from about 1893 to 96, notice how the figures in sort of the left and then at the bottom have been cut off by the edges of the frame. And then on the right side, notice the sort of abrupt jump in scale between this little man in the straw hat, and he has a cane. He's seemingly kind of stuck inside the cab or the carriage here. And then we have this man passing through in the background. And so the chance of a moment kind of lines up these two figures in a visual juxtaposition that was really over within the blink of an eye. And so the unposed quality of the snapshot, along with its sense of capturing a fleeting moment of a scene that sort of extends beyond the edges of the picture plane, this was totally new in the art world. And these snapshots or candid photographs would be highly influential for avant-garde artists in Paris and other parts of Europe, as well as the United States throughout the later 19th and earlier 20th centuries.